morning and welcome to Rising. Thank you so much for tuning in and happy Monday. Good to see you as always, Niall.
Always a pleasure to see you, Robby, in this Monday of Thanksgiving week.
Yes,
feeling
indeed.
a holiday kind of mood?
Yes, I am. I'm counting down the days, eager to see my family back in Michigan at the end of the week. Going to travel there, so I'm excited for that.
Excellent. Well, excited on your behalf, but also excited to know, Robby, what is on your radar?
Indeed. Well, the verdict is in, and it's more bad news for Democrats. Americans broadly approve of the Trump transition and of Donald Trump's picks for the new administration. The president-elect has, for the most part, finished rounding out his cabinet, and the likes of Tulsi Gabbard, Pete Hegseth, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and others seems to have impressed the voters almost as much as they horrify liberal elites at mainstream media institutions. According to new polling from CBS News and from YouGov, 59% of all Americans approve of Trump's handling so far of the presidential transition. 59% is a pretty healthy margin in these days of extreme polarization. Now, Republican voters are, of course, more excited about what's to come than Democratic voters, but even a majority of Democrats polled said they were not particularly motivated to oppose Trump in this moment. Astonishing. Meanwhile, Trump is drawing significant support from young voters. In the same poll, Trump's most favorable demographic numbers actually came from voters under the age of 30. Trump earned a 65% approval rating from this cohort. Now, that's astonishing. So much for the old adage that young people lean liberal and become more conservative over time. Young people today are, by some calculations, more reliably right-leaning than older Americans. It just goes to show that Democratic hopes and Republican fears that demographics are destiny and the GOP would eventually be forever doomed to obscurity due to the changing makeup of America. Nope, did not work out like that at all. Now, according to the polling, this highest political priority among all Americans is to lower the price of goods and services. No other issue came anywhere close to that in terms of importance, according to this poll. Now, the American people could not be clearer that they voted for a clean break with the failed policies of the Biden-Harris agenda, and with the reckless spending that many economists argue have contributed massively to inflation. Americans are sick, spending more on groceries, more on rent, more on gas, more on insurance, and so on. Trump should and must move quickly to address this reality, and the Democratic Party, which is out of power because the voters do not trust its leadership, should fall in line with the agenda or risk its own irrelevance. Now, unfortunately, prominent Democrats are resorting to the all too familiar tactics to legitimize Trump's picks for top cabinet spots. Take Illinois Senator Tammy Duckworth, who asserted on CNN this weekend that Tulsi Gabbard, a former fellow Democrat who will now join Trump's cabinet as Director of National Intelligence, is compromised and effectively a Russian asset.
She's a critic of U.S. intelligence operations. She has promoted Russian propaganda. Your fellow Democrat, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, called her, quote, likely a Russian asset. Now, you and Tulsi Gabbard are both veterans. You served with her in the House. What do you think of her?
Well, I think she's compromised. I think by going to Syria and basically backing a brutal dictator there, Russian-controlled media called her a Russian asset. So I do think that we have a real deep concern whether or not she's a compromised person, and frankly, the U.S. intelligence committee, the U.S. intelligence community has identified her as having troubling relationships with America's foes, and so my worry is that she couldn't pass a background check.
It's contemptible. Shame on Duckworth for parroting these absurd talking points that if you criticize U.S. foreign policy, you are effectively a Russian agent. But notice CNN's complicity here. Dana Bash set up the question as follows. Tulsi is, quote, a critic of U.S. intelligence operations. She has promoted Russian propaganda. As if these are the same thing. If you echo some foreign criticisms of the U.S. government, even those criticisms are well-founded, you are accused of being in league with the U.S.'s enemies. Now, back in 2019, when Gabbard was running as a Democrat for the Democratic Party's presidential nomination, she clarified her stance on all this. She said that while she did not personally think Syrian dictator Bashar Assad was, quote, a good person, she also did not think he was an enemy of the United States such that we should intervene in the civil war taking place there in Syria. By the way, she added that Vladimir Putin was in fact an adversary of the U.S., some Russian asset. Gabbard believes, as a great many Americans do, that the toppling of liberal regimes illiberal regimes, all over the world, is not in the best interest of global security, nor of U.S. security. That for all the trillions of dollars and lives lost, policing the world and installing ostensibly pro-U.S. governments, what has resulted is death, waste, corruption, and instability. Gabbard believes that U.S. intelligence experts are well aware of these dynamics and have not been honest with the American people about them. She believes, as Donald Trump apparently does, that it is time to change things in the federal intelligence bureaucracy and make it responsive to actual levers of democratic control, to the will of the people, to Congress, and to the president, not to a permanent cabal of intractable G-men. If Democrats like Tammy Duckworth want to stand in the way of this, well, that's their prerogative. They might want to come up with a more unique playbook instead of doing Russia, Russia, Russia all over again. Hasn't worked yet, but there's always next time.
Good stuff, interesting stuff, provocative stuff, as you're doing, Robby. Glad to see it.
Thank you, Niall.
So before we get into Tulsi Gabbard, which I think is really important, just on those poll numbers about the Trump
what did you make of
transition,
them?
What I made of them was that actually people do, of course, accept that he won, so there isn't any real dispute about that.
It's always a plus.
It is always a plus, yes. It didn't happen.
Wish we saw more of that last time. I'll
Absolutely.
happy to concede that to
Yes. The other thing is that I think that actually what voters tend to punish people about when they first come into power or coming into power is retreating from their promises, the suggestion that they're going to do something different to what they promised. And Trump has pushed through, or is seeking to push through, nominees who are quite in line with what he promised. So it doesn't surprise me that much that the numbers are reasonably good. I do think it's... Democrats, I think, will continue to oppose him. That question about are Democrats motivated to oppose him now he's president was slightly confusingly worded. I mean, there were still 46% of Democrats who said it made no difference. And I assume that just means they're opposed to him and will continue to be opposed to him, and it will just remain consistent. Young people moving to the right is definitely an interesting trend. And
if you looked at those demographic, that was his best statistic. That was higher statistic for him than like the white vote or any of that nature. It was young people under 30.
And that is one of the things about politics, that it is endlessly fascinating because politics develops in ways that you don't anticipate sometimes. I had not envisioned there being a rightward shift 5 years ago, say, and there pretty obviously has been, whether that is dissatisfaction with the status quo, whether it's a matter of people leaning on more independent sources of information.
The success of the podcast strategy is what I think it points to.
That's very interesting. Now, on Tulsi Gabbard, I am somewhere in the middle ground, which is never a comfortable place to be because you tend to get run over. There is the argument about, I think that Washington too often sort of fetishizes experience or being well seasoned in the foreign policy establishment. And whether you look at, Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden, or you look at Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, very well seasoned people have often backed a course that has plainly appeared wrong in retrospect. So in that, to the extent that Gabbard shouldn't be kind of criticized for being heterodox, I think that's fine. Even in terms of Russia and Ukraine, she raises the point about NATO expansionism, which I think is a valid point. She doesn't, for my money, acknowledge that Putin doesn't really think Ukraine exists. He doesn't think there's a separate Ukrainian people. And then the thing that really gives me pause with her is the Assad stuff. I know in your radar you suggested how she has clarified it, but she has backed Russian intervention in the Syrian civil war while being opposed to American intervention. So is she really anti-interventionist, or is she just anti-American intervention, which I think is a problem?
Well, that's fair. I'm certainly against American intervention and Russian intervention. And you get into this weird position I have no doubt. And again, she said that Assad is not a good person. I could use even stronger language. He's a brutal murderer. But there's as Donald Trump famously said to Bill O'Reilly when asked about, I think, Putin, he said, well, he's a killer, right? And Trump said, not incorrectly. This was not a thing you could say at the time. A lot of killers out there, Bill. You think we're so innocent? And it's true. There are a lot of bad regimes all over the place, and we just can't go around blowing up everybody we don't like. I mean, it's not because it's morally wrong to, if something happened to us, Assad fell down the staircase tomorrow, boo-hoo, we're not shedding any tears, but we have to, again, live in reality. Well, what kind of regime comes in then when that happens? And what we found throughout the Middle East is we get more terrorism, or when we topple the kind of autocratic but not religiously extremist person, we get ISIS or Al-Qaeda or whatever.
Yeah, and I vividly remember that O'Reilly interview you were talking about, and it was one of those moments where you could really see the kind of traditional lines of American politics get fuzzy, because at one time, if someone on the left had said that, they would have been, cast out of
they hate America.
society. Yeah,
Why do they hate America?
So it's wild stuff.
Trump has scrambled many things.
He has, absolutely.
Well, we will be continuing to talk about Trump's cabinet appointments, which, as I said, are mostly made at this point, but we're going to look at a few of them a little bit more closely coming up right after this. President-elect Donald Trump has assembled his cabinet. Trump tapped billionaire Scott Bessent as Secretary of the Treasury. He also announced Oregon Congresswoman Lori Chavez DeRemer to lead the Department of Labor, Florida Representative Dave Weldon to be Director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and Dr. Marty Makary to head the FDA. He also picked Dr. Jeanette Neshawite for Surgeon General. Those last two were people on Fox News frequently.
Perhaps one of the most newsworthy announcements was Trump naming Russell Vought, an architect of the controversial Project 2025, to lead the Office of Management and Budget. If confirmed, he'd be going back to his roots. He previously served in Trump's OMB during the president-elect's first term. Trump picked another ally, Brooke Rollins, for Secretary of Agriculture. Rollins is currently the CEO of the America First Policy Institute, a conservative pro-Trump think tank that has been a landing spot for other members of the previous Trump administration. Trump also chose his first black nominee, NFL veteran and conservative commentator Scott Turner, to spearhead HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development.
A slew of reactions have been pouring in. Former Rising co-host Batya Ungar-Sargon wrote on X, Trump's cabinet is one of the most progressive in decades. It's anti-war, pro-union, committed to tariffs, hawkish on immigration, signaling how seriously Trump is taking the task of elevating the working-class Americans who gave him victory. Days before Trump announced Turner, CNN pundit Bakari Sellers jumped the gun, posting, quote, "Blacks for Trump, don't worry, we just want y'all to know you're not qualified," criticizing the lack of black nominees at that point. Conservative commentator and host on The Blaze, Jason Whitlock, however, wrote, quote, "There are some of us black folk that prioritize values over skin color, more concerned with policies than race. I don't care whether or not Trump named any black people to his cabinet. I care about whether the policies they enact make it easier for Christians and patriotic Americans to live in this country." Establishment critic Tara Bull reacted with this, "The left, Trump is a misogynist Trump. Cabinet picks." She posted a picture then of the women Trump selected to be in his administration so far, demonstrating that maybe Mark Cuban was wrong about Trump not wanting to surround himself with talented, smart women. Yeah. He certainly picked a number of women, including his chief of staff, Susan Wiles, the education secretary, Tulsi Gabbard, and many, many, many others, the press secretary, and so on. There's a great number of women who have been, as if a full binder of them
full of women.
To borrow a Mitt Romney phrase that got him in trouble for no good reason whatsoever.
We are showing our age. I hope all our audience knows what we're referring to when Mitt Romney ran in 2012 against Barack Obama. He claimed to have binders full of women to choose from. I do think it's interesting, though, Robbie, that in relation to the Trump picks, people are, understandably enough, from a Trump sympathetic position, noting the number of women that he has nominated to important positions, as you've just outlined. And then when it comes to the scarcity of black people who he has nominated, kind of saying, well, it doesn't really matter. Jason Whitlock was making that argument in the tweet we posted. I mean, diversity either matters or it doesn't. You can't just sort of say it's important because he does it this time, but it doesn't matter when he doesn't do it in that area.
I mean, that's fair. It should, I would say it just does, well, diversity should matter in terms of background and experience, and certainly your gender or your race it informs how you were perceived all your life and impacts you, and so I wouldn't say it doesn't matter or something like that. Also overlaps with various economic realities and class-based realities, but most people would agree, including most women, most black people, most Asian people, most Jewish people, most every subcategory. We just want the most qualified people in the world to be staffing the administration. The only people who are like, no, it has to be a black woman or something are the MSNBC commentators in the increasingly irrelevant MSNBC, soon to be bought, perhaps. Did you see this last week? Maybe you and Amber talked about it. I don't know.
No, I don't think we did.
Oh, Elon and Don Jr. have been talking about buying MSNBC.
Trolling, Robby.
Oh,
I don't know why that could happen.
My response to that is, who would we make fun of if we didn't have them to kick around anymore? I mean, I like the idea of Elon MSNBC.
I mean, you like it a lot more than I do. I would be equally appalled by an Elon.
Oh, I'm eyeing the 9 p.m. hour on an Elon MSNBC.
I can't even begin to know where we go with that.
Anyway.
In relation to, I actually sort of segueing off the point you were making about, the most qualified person and all of that, rather than the choices that are either promoting diversity or can be seen more negatively. One of the most interesting things, I think, trying to be objective about Trump's picks, is the very different ideologies that are represented within those picks. So you have some really quite establishment people. Marco Rubio, for example, yeah, he has some, more interesting elements. But, you were mentioning in your radar this morning Tulsi Gabbard. There's not a lot of common ground in the worldviews of a Marco Rubio and a Tulsi Gabbard, for example. There's also the point that I think we alluded to in the introduction here, or someone mentioned it in one of the tweets, about the pro-union or pro-Labour kind of element in it. Laurie Chavez-Derrimer, the proposed Labour secretary, was one of only 3 Republicans in the House to vote for legislation that protects the right to organise and so forth. Now, whether that is Trump seeking to bolster working class support, which obviously he has made progress on in the past, maybe, but I mean, it's something that is unexpected, I would say, by mainstream or what used to be mainstream Republicans.
Ross Douthat at the New York Times wrote a really interesting column this weekend about 3 ways you can look at the picks and try to explain them. And the first way is, noting that these are people of diverse ideological backgrounds. So one way is that, it's assembling a kind of team of rivals based on and rewarding of specific interest groups who helped contribute to Trump's victory. RFK Jr. fell in line, brought in some of those people who echo his views on health-related matters. So he's rewarded, they're rewarded, they have a seat at the table. Same thing for the Tulsi Gabbard contingent of what was at some point a progressive left worldview, and if she's brought some people with her, so she gets that reward. He's giving something to establishment Republicans in the form of Marco Rubio, and so on and so forth. That's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is he has picked people who are specifically combative with the agency or the department they've been selected to run. Maybe you can't quite make that case in the Rubio example, but in the others you really can. Tulsi Gabbard, leading critic of the intelligence community, she's picked to run it. RFK Jr., unrelentingly critical of health, science, food, drug regulators, picked to run that agency, and so on and down the line.
But to that point, I think that's valid enough to a degree. I think the concern I would have, and lots of people on the Liberal side would have, would be when that extends to the Department of Justice and Pam Bondi as the proposed Attorney General, because she is someone who, firstly, like way back in 2016, kind of led chants of lock her up aimed at Hillary Clinton, but more to the point was at least credulous about suggesting that the 2020 election was fraudulent in some way. And so having that person, I think, atop the Department of Justice is very concerning for a lot of people.
At the same time, she has, I think, reassured a lot of people because she's less of a, what's the right word to describe, a colorful character compared to Matt Gaetz. I think even a lot of establishment Republicans who do not buy into the things said about the election in 2020 were very elated to have her picked for this spot. And then the third reason, just to go back to this, that Ross Douthat said that these choices could have been made, and the one I actually agree with, and I alluded to at some other point in the show today, is Trump is primarily, we should never forget, Trump is first and foremost a media and entertainment figure who has tapped into something in the American psychology that he understands that traditional political figures and the parties and the ideologues have not understood. And he has picked people, I mean, so much of his cabinet is taken from Fox News. He has picked people who are very good in the areas of the media where he has also excelled, social media, television, to make the case to the American people that the Trump Republican agenda is working for them. He has picked people who are very good at that, at excelling as communicators. So I wonder if we're moving into a role where the job of the person leading the department is really to be that communicator. And then I'm sure even as provocative and heterodox a thinker or operator as Tulsi Gabbard, you're still going to have people behind them who are more traditional party operators or government operators, but the leader of the organization, the front man, the person you see, is someone whose skill set, whose biggest value add is selling the American people or selling the people paying attention to social media and watching on TV that this is the agenda that works for them.
And I actually agree with that, and I think it's something that Democrats need to learn
Yes.
from. And I was talking about this actually with someone else at the weekend. The Trump realizes, I think, that the old style of political communication, which is that you sit down on Meet the Press or 60 Minutes or whatever, and the person says, in 2003 you said this, and now you don't believe that. I'm not saying there's no place for that, but that is now an insufficient way by far to communicate with an American public that has become more accustomed to all kinds of social media, to podcasts, and to seeing a more authentic, unbuttoned version of political figures. And so I think Trump sees that. I don't really disparage people purely on the basis that they're TV commentators, obviously. I think that it's an
important skill set, damn it.
It's an important skill set.
We should be governed by TV commentators.
Should be better paid all around.
Yes.
But the point is communication has changed radically, and I think Democrats have been left behind to some extent in that respect.
I agree. We've got a lot more to come today on Rising, including a great interview with our friend Micheal Shellenberger and many other topics. We'll discuss more of the cabinet picks and some funny moments from Justin Trudeau, Brian Williams, Bill Maher, and others. Stay tuned.
An Israel-Hezbollah ceasefire deal may be on the horizon. According to Axios, Israel and Lebanon have reached an agreement to end the fighting between the pair. This comes amid the ongoing conflict in the region that has claimed over 3,500 Lebanese lives and injured more than 15,000 civilians. Speaking to Axios, US officials said the Israeli Security Cabinet could approve the deal as early as Tuesday, though there are sticking points.
Though Israel has eliminated nearly all of Hezbollah's military leaders, the group has continued to fire missiles into Israel. Tens of thousands of Israelis have evacuated from the border to escape the fighting. There's growing pressure on the Israeli government to end the fighting so that the displaced people can return home. Now, both sides traded strikes over the weekend, with the biggest coming from Hezbollah since Israel launched a widespread bombardment of Lebanon 2 months ago. If a ceasefire deal is reached, this would be a win, of course, for the outgoing Joe Biden administration. Is it too little too late, however? Speaking on Face the Nation on Sunday, Democratic Senator Chris Van Hollen signaled his displeasure with the way President Biden has handled this conflict.
But I also wish the president had effectively used U.S. leverage to essentially assert his own positions. We've seen this pattern where President Biden makes demands of Prime Minister Netanyahu only to be ignored or slapped down entirely. And then President Biden sends more bombs and more money. Mm-hmm. That is not an effective use of leverage. So I do hope in these closing months, the president will finally make more effective use of American leverage to, at the very least, uphold American law, to insist that the Netanyahu government allow humanitarian aid into Gaza and that they use our weapons in a manner consistent with the laws of war.
Yeah, Chris Van Hollen's point there is very well taken. I've agreed with it. I've made it several times. I don't know why the pressure would suddenly get more increased or dramatic from Joe Biden. It already harmed what was his re-election effort and then was Kamala Harris's election effort, clearly, in that the Arab American Muslim vote breaking significantly for Jill Stein or even for Trump in places like in Michigan, a pivotal second most important state to win. Joe Biden has failed to motivate or move Netanyahu's policy in any way, as far as I can tell. And what's important for viewers to realize is that this is somewhat historically unprecedented. The U.S. has always been staunchly, the U.S. government, staunchly on Israel's side. We've been supporters since the beginning, Harry Truman, etc. But Republican and Democratic administrations have told Israel to rein it in when the chaos or the violence has become too bad, and we have started to worry about the security position of Israel and of ourselves. Reagan did this with Israel in very similar circumstances, and that was the end of their intervention. Biden has not done that. No. Biden has said he doesn't like it, but he hasn't done anything about it, and that is outside the norm for the way things used to be.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think it has really marred Joe Biden's presidency. There has been this sense throughout that he has repeatedly sort of said that he's very cross with Netanyahu and nothing ever happens, and that has happened about the provision of aid into Gaza. It has happened about the enormous civilian death toll in Gaza. It has happened about the invasion of Lebanon and assorted other things. And I'm not quite sure why Biden has given up the sense of leverage, to use Senator Van Hollen's words, in such a blatant way. Now, of course, on the left, it feeds suspicion that really it is the expression of misgivings that is kind of fake, that Biden actually agrees with the policy and is just trying to find...
That would be more honest if he would just say that. For instance, John Fetterman, for instance, agrees with the policy, thinks we should support what they're doing, and is transparent and honest about it. Joe Biden says he does not agree with the policy, but doesn't do anything about it, even though we have now, and I don't think we should order our allies around. Again, I don't want to police the world, but we do give them lots of money and support that we don't have to give them. So it is fine, in my view, for that to come with strings attached, or to just not give it at all, which is what I would advocate. If we're giving it, it should come with some strings attached. But he's just totally unwilling to use that leverage.
No, absolutely. And the amounts of money and aid involved are enormous. There was a study by Brown University fairly recently that would consider it was, I think it was 17.8, certainly almost $18 billion of military aid in a year.
Israel is a more financially stable country than we are. They have a lower debt to GDP ratio than we do. Why are we bailing out their military? Doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
And the other point is, when Biden leans into the more traditional liberal or democratic argument about the importance of human rights and all of that, this just makes a mockery of that. I mean, you cannot really legitimately be contending that you're sort of holding up the importance of proportionality or protecting civilians or getting aid in with one hand while shoveling enormous amounts of bombs and missiles with the other. On the Lebanon question, just briefly, Robbie, before we sort of wrap this up, I mean, that is a very complicated situation. Hezbollah struck Israel basically as soon as October 7th happened. The Israelis then ultimately invaded Lebanon, which is obviously an invasion of another sovereign nation. And although we think these ceasefire talks are reaching something approximating a agreement of a kind, it's very, very up in the air. There's all sorts of disagreements about which nations should be monitoring who complies with the terms of the ceasefire. There are all sorts of questions about whether the Israelis actually want to reserve the right to go into Lebanon again. And I think to look at the big picture, this all wraps into the question, which also pertains in Gaza, about whether Benjamin Netanyahu personally really wants peace, because there are political and legal vulnerabilities to him at home if the conflict in either place ends.
Yes, his incentives are certainly very perverse. It seems a difficult problem. Israel has come under assault from terrorist groups in the surrounding areas, including obviously on October 7th, when I think it had to respond and retaliate against a massacre of that level by this terrorist group, but in responding to it has killed thousands and thousands of people, of children, of non-combatants, has leveled Gaza, has totally destroyed it, and in the process has killed the planner, the organizer of the terrorist attacks, Yahya Sinwar, and then has not, could have unfurled the mission accomplished banner then, but as you said, the effort has continued under Netanyahu, who might have incentives to keep to remain at war so as not to face the consequences
Right.
for his actions, which include allowing the terrorist attack to occur. It occurred under his watch. There's something, even if you agree with his policies, as to be clear, many Israelis do, and I have serious questions about whether if a different administration was in charge, you would get a markedly different policy. Maybe you would, maybe you wouldn't. But he ought to go on the sole basis of having failed his country on that level.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's certainly...
even from a hardliner position.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly the hardliner position. I think there are a lot of people... I mean, there are obviously peace groups in Israel. I mean, a more... It has got quite hollowed out over the years. Mm-hmm. But I think in terms of the global opinion, certainly, there is widespread revulsion, really, at the way Israel has conducted that campaign. The thousands of people killed, the starvation of people, the just shunting people from one zone to another, really appalling stuff. And I think, in fact, in the biggest picture of all, that has isolated Israel to a much greater extent on the international stage and has hollowed out what used to be bipartisan support for Israel here to a large extent as well.
Coming up next on Rising, we've got an interview with friend of the show, Micheal Shellenberger. You won't want to miss that. Stick around. Since President-elect Donald Trump announced Tulsi Gabbard as his nominee to be the Director of National Intelligence, the left has been throwing daggers at her in the mainstream media as well. As I mentioned during my radar earlier in the show, Democrats have a bullseye on Gabbard's back. Senator Tammy Duckworth accused her of being compromised, and Senator Elizabeth Warren called her, quote, a Russian asset, as did many others in liberal media. Journalist Micheal Shellenberger makes the case that these attacks are counterproductive.
He wrote on X, Trump's nominee for Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, is a threat to national security, say the media and government officials. She's not, and no one has presented any evidence to the contrary. The real threat to our security and freedom comes from our rogue intelligence community. Tesla CEO Elon Musk responded to Shellenberger on X, writing 100.
Joining us now to discuss is journalist and friend of the show, Micheal Shellenberger. So nice to see you again.
Good to be with you, Robby.
So is this how mainstream media institutions and many political figures are going to respond to a figure like Tulsi Gabbard, who is, outside the traditional intelligence community paradigms, by saying that if you disagree with them, or if you've at all echoed or said there's some validity to what a foreign government or the Russian government has said about a foreign policy issue, that makes you what, a deep cover Russian agent? Maybe she was like the Black Widow character from Marvel, maybe being trained as a Russian assassin from birth, something like that?
Yeah. Well, I think it's really interesting. I think that this shift of the Democrats embracing basically Russophobia, which really starts in 2016 when the intelligence community claims that Trump was and his associates were somehow compromised by the Russians. Of course, that became Russiagate. That appeared to have been really just a campaign dirty trick that has now turned into a sort of longstanding framing by the Democrats of Republicans. It's odd because it's traditionally a right-wing attack on the left, of course, going all the way back to McCarthyism. I mean, you see in Tulsi Gabbard somebody who has basically your basic kind of progressive Democrat views, from the Barack Obama era. I don't see a huge number of differences. I mean, obviously, after he came into power, Obama was involved in Arab Spring and the Syrian war, which he's also a controversy part of. But as the New York Times notes, there's never been any shred of evidence that she's ever been compromised. It's just rhetorical at this point. They've accused her of spreading misinformation on things like supporting biolabs in Ukraine. Well, the U.S. Department of Defense did help the Ukrainians with biolab safety. Certainly, she met with Assad, the head of Syria. That's controversial. On the other hand, I think the mood of the country right now is we're very tired of foreign wars. I think she reflects what a lot of Americans want, which is a negotiated end to the situation in Ukraine, negotiation to the end of the Israel-Palestine conflict. So I see in Tulsi Gabbard somebody who has views that are pretty solidly within the liberal side of the political spectrum, but just because of the fact that she's joined the Trump administration, wants to join the Trump administration, has opened herself up to these McCarthyite attacks on her around Russia.
Let me push back on one element of that, Michael, because I do on one hand take the point about the McCarthyism, the idea of smearing people who are simply expressing, unorthodox or unapproved foreign policy ideas. But in relation to Gabbard's views on the Syrian civil war, it doesn't seem to me fair, with all due respect, to say that those are kind of Obama-era Democratic views. She takes the view, as I understand it, that the people opposed to Bashar al-Assad are overwhelmingly Islamist radicals, and therefore it is quite justified for Russia to weigh in on I'll get this right yet, Russia to weigh in on Assad's side. That's not what Obama believed, right?
No, for sure. And I should say that I'm really referring to Obama, the candidate in 2008. Obviously, he engaged in the Arab Spring and the Syrian conflict. And if she said that if she reduced the opponents of Assad to just radical Islamicists, I don't agree with that. I'm sure she said other things I don't agree with and that we all might disagree with. I've certainly said things that I don't agree with in the past, particularly around foreign policy in my younger days. But I just think we're all a little bit, older now, a little bit more grown up. I think that Gabbard is somebody that we need to take a strong role in cleaning up the intelligence community. There's just been 50 years since the last time we had a proper house cleaning of the intelligence community. Since then, we have had the intelligence community involved in creating a censorship industrial complex, involved in creating a Russia collusion hoax around a sitting president. We've had the intelligence community involved in a disinformation campaign around the Hunter Biden laptop, involved both the FBI and CIA. I think there's been a lot of concern that Trump would come in and want revenge. I don't need revenge. I think we need truth and reconciliation. But you do need a character who is established for independence from the intelligence community, but also who does have strong national security bona fides. We should keep in mind that she's been a Army Reserve officer for a couple of decades, I believe. And so someone that's not soft on terrorism by any means, advocated going after ISIS, which we did. So I just think with Gabbard, she's just been framed as kind of somewhere like a horseshoe, far left, far right person. But I think that her views are pretty well within the mainstream and is a strong character that I think the country needs right now to kind of clean up the intelligence community and restore confidence in the intelligence and security agencies.
Shifting gears a bit, wanted to ask you about another subject. I know you were in Australia recently. You were down under fighting against some social media censorship legislation there that I believe had an interesting age verification aspect. This is a topic I'm very interested to delve into further because while I absolutely understand the concerns many families might have about social media usage, or particularly excessive social media usage, among young people, we have to keep in mind that any kind of age verification system is, giving license to the government to then track who's visiting. There's no way to restrict that to just young people. That'd be everybody having to hand in their IDs to travel to websites, which seems like a very dangerous, slippery slope to head down. Tell us more about the work you were doing there.
Sure. Well, the good news is that the censorship legislation that the Australians were considering has been defeated. The government withdrew it after a significant number of parties, including all of the swing voters in the Senate. They're called crossbenchers because they're not part of a big party. So that's gone and defeated, which is a wonderful victory. At the same time, on the heels of it comes this social media ban on people under the age of 16. I should say, as a father of two Zoomers that grew up with too much social media, I do agree with the need to restrict social media. I agree with Jonathan Haidt's analysis that social media has contributed to a significant amount of anxiety, in particular that fishbowl effect. At the same time, Jonathan Haidt, in particular, has focused on phone-free classrooms and also around creating parent groups where the parents agree to limit social media for the kids. In Australia, I heard about a proposal to actually give children and adolescents special kinds of smartphones that don't have social media on them, but allow for some texting and some phone calls. I think that we underestimate the importance of social norms. There's a lot of laws in our society that it's really hard to enforce with the police, or that you don't want to because it actually creates more harms, but you might still have a prohibition on it. The concern now in Australia is that they're using this under 16 age ban to create digital IDs, which is something that the World Economic Forum has famously championed. It's become the source of endless conspiracy theories, but nonetheless is a real possibility. And yesterday, Senator Matt Canavan in Australia confirmed in his interrogation of the government that the e-safety commissioner, who's an American, by the way, that she could implement a digital IDs under this bill. So they're trying to get that taken out right now. But this is one of the things that we've seen, Robbie, that is so concerning, is that we'll see governments around the world, they try to hide their censorship programs inside of a cybersecurity initiative. And now they're trying to hide basically digital monitoring, digital IDs, the potential for social credit and something to kind of reward, good speech and punish bad speech online. They're trying to sort of hide that in a social media ban for kids. I think we have to be vigilant to it. I think there's just other ways to deal with this problem than making everybody have to have a digital ID or to end anonymity online altogether.
Yeah, I very much agree with that. And some of those suggestions you mentioned there, right? It doesn't have to be a government initiative or certainly a criminal issue every time you want to, modify human behavior somewhat. Like, having phone time in schools, in classrooms being limited sounds totally sane to me. Like, it's the phone has as much capabilities as like the Game Boy. Of course, you're not going to let like a Game Boy be in the students using it when they're supposed to be learning. Does it need to be a government criminal enterprise? No, you can just create environments or incentivize that kind of thing. I think is so smart without exactly giving governments the tools to do massive screening or surveillance or anything of that nature. Micheal Shellenberger, thank you for fighting the good fight. We'll have you back soon. Always a pleasure.
Good to be with you.
Bill Maher clashed with scientist Neil deGrasse Tyson over transgender issues in Friday's episode of Real Time with Bill Maher. The host and deGrasse Tyson sparred over why Democrats lost the November elections and if it did, in fact, have anything to do with transgender culture wars. Let's watch that clip.
I'm not for canceling anybody on either side.
Yeah.
So But here's what I think is the scandal.
What?
This is in Scientific American.
Yeah.
Less than a year ago. Inequity between male and female athletes is a result not of inherent biological differences between the sexes, but of biases in how they are treated in sports. That's nuts. And it sure ain't scientific, and it's in Scientific American. And that's why the Democrats lost the election. It's true.
Bill, every 20 minutes on your platform, you come up with another reason why the Democrats lost.
No.
You already have the answer. They lost the election. So anything you say
That's
is
not
why
true.
they did it.
First of all, you don't watch this show, so you don't know that. I know you don't, and it's okay. But you talk as if you do, and you don't. And that's okay. Just don't bullshit me. That's the one thing people can't ever do on this show is bullshit me. And that's fine. But I don't say that. I have very good reasons. But engage with the idea here. What I'm asking is, Scientific American is saying, basically, that the reason why an WNBA team can't beat the Lakers is because of societal bias.
What you're saying is not Scientific American says that. An editor for Scientific American says that, who no longer has the job. So don't indict a 170-year-old magazine because somebody
Okay, this is called Scientific American, and they're printing something
because someone enters the cesspool that is social media and then participates in that exchange. So
why can't you
let's talk about science.
Why can't you just say this is not scientific and Scientific American should do better?
It looked like they were having a fun time.
Absolutely, a good debate. It's almost magazine-like over in Real Time with Bill Maher these days.
Yes.
Now, well, I have a few views on this, as you might imagine. One thing I thought was interesting was how uneasy Neil deGrasse Tyson seemed there.
Yes. Not a man who is reluctant to share his opinion.
No. And
generally.
Right, exactly. And he seemed to be avoiding the point that Bill Maher was making. Now, I have taken exception to various things Bill Maher has said in the past, and I do think on the election, and indeed in terms of politics generally, he is prone to deciding that the certain number of things that Bill Maher cares about passionately are the things that are decisive in elections and nothing else matters. So I don't love that. But Maher's point was about this contention in a purportedly scientific magazine that gender disparity in performance was a product of societal biases or prejudices rather than biological differences. That seems on its face a fairly absurd argument.
Yes.
And Neil deGrasse, and you and I have spoken about this before, and Neil deGrasse Tyson was sort of avoiding that. Just one more point, Robbie, on this. In another segment of that discussion, they were talking about the sports issue, and Tyson said, well, women actually do perhaps have an advantage in long-distance swimming, which is true, but for biologically different reasons, which is that women typically have a greater proportion of their body weight in body fat, which gives female bodies extra buoyancy, which can be of assistance in
exactly. That's a biological difference. Because
exactly.
there are differences in the aggregate, and there are some areas of overlap, but they're not. It's starker differences in terms of elite athletic ability than movies and entertainment suggest to us when there's always like a kick-ass female soldier or assassin or something. Doesn't exist in real life for the most part.
Well, I mean, there are female assassins in real life, but anyway, yes. But there are,
there are exceptional abilities, and there are occasional people who have some biological abnormalities or genitalia, both unusual. Yes, there are exceptions to every rule, and we got to figure out how to accommodate those people in non-cruel sorts of ways. But it's just so clear in terms of sports. So they were talking about Scientific American, where this editor, whose name is Laura Helmuth, recently resigned after she had a profanity-laced post-election take where she said Gen X, she went after her own generation, Gen X, being full of effing fascists, F them to the moon and back, she said of people celebrating Trump's victory. You know, what? I don't care about that. But we had Jesse Singal, who's a writer, a very slightly left of center, has been attacked by a lot of people on the left, but writes about science issues from, I would say, a free speech perspective and a anti-cancel culture perspective. He wrote an article for the magazine I write for, Reason, about her tenure there, and it's not just like one or two bad tweets from this woman. She presided over this very prestigious institution publishing so much nonsense on these kinds of topics. He has a roundup of them. Scientific American, he writes, under Helmuth, when it was bad, it was really bad. They published Denial of Evolution is a Form of White Supremacy. They published, this is my favorite one, Why the Term Jedi is Problematic for Describing Programs that Promote Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. So DEI is usually the shorthand we use for this, but apparently at some point people were proposing Jedi for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. You know, that's catchier. Jedi is, we know what Jedi are from Star Wars. Sure. But so this is an article saying don't call these programs Jedi because in the Star Wars franchise, the Jedi are a religious order of intergalactic police monks prone to white saviorism and toxic masculinity. Violent duels with phallic lightsabers, gaslighting by means of Jedi mind tricks, etc. You'd think this is parody. No. This was actually published in Scientific American.
I mean, I certainly hope you know that I'm not going to be defending that sort of thing. Look, I mean, I don't know anything really about Laura Helmuth except the fracas that erupted over those tweets. Well, they were actually on Blue Sky, I believe, but the social media messages going after people who had voted for Trump. The excerpt that you just read seems pretty risible. I'm sure she would defend her tenure in other ways. I've no idea exactly what those ways are. But the bigger point is, I think, about how discussions around science have become politicized, and people typically on the left would complain about the influence of industry or moneyed interests on science and whether research has been skewed to support sort of corporate interests. But then whenever you do have something like the Scientific American, a very prestigious publication, as you say, appearing to adopt a very, very ideological and quote-unquote woke lens to look at science, I think that's obviously a problem.
I mean, I will never forget. I remember where I was when my just faith in like scientific experts was broken. I was sitting on the middle of the pandemic, sitting on my patio, the summer of the initial year of the pandemic, and I was seeing statements on Twitter and quotes from Fauci-esque people, not exactly Fauci, but all saying that as the protests were spilling out into riots over George Floyd, the summer of Black Lives Matter and everything, and the same people who had said that that everything had to be shut down and locked down and wear a mask on the side, and we were still in the midst of absolute levels of lockdown, and you'd been accused of an exercise in ritual human sacrifice for just going to the beach, as they said of people in Florida. But the protesters, because they were protesting racial injustice, and racial injustice is also a kind of malady for which the cure is mass social unrest, that was okay. And that broke me, and that broke a lot of people, because racism is not a disease in the same sense that COVID was a disease. It's not your diagnosis that this is is a political science or social change kind of argument that protesting is the right way. Maybe it is or maybe it isn't, but you as a disease reacher have no expertise or knowledge about what moves public opinion or what is the right way to respond to a complicated social problem versus an actual medical problem. And that was when I realized, these people are just going to say, they're now going to purport to be experts in every realm of human behavior. And then if you challenge them, they're going to say, well, you can't disagree with scientists. And I really dislike that, as did a lot of people watching right now.
I think that is part of a longer discussion, Robby, about the politicization of science, and we can get to that at some other point. And I think today we will get in a later segment through the issue of, we will return to the issue of the trans topic and the election. Veteran news anchor Brian Williams had some advice for the Democrats for how they handled this year's election. This is what Williams said during an interview with NBC's late-night host Seth Meyers last week. Let's watch.
It is tough love time for the Democratic Party. I think it needs to be stripped down and rebuilt. I think that means a change in leadership. I want to know who thought it was a good idea that Joe Biden stand for another 4 years at 80 years of age and 37% popularity. So then that saddled the party with a British-like short campaign season for them. I think it's insulting when members of the working class, which the Democratic Party has lost entirely in our lifetimes, to insist the economy's doing great. A 12-pack of Bounty is $40. Rich folks don't feel that. Poor folks already switched to Sparkle during the COVID, during the lockdown. And I think telling them that the NASDAQ is gangbusters is further insulting. It's insulting. I think the biggest unforced error of the Biden administration by far was the border. To tell people it's not a problem is insulting. For the working class to see incoming migrants getting welcome bags, debit cards, and motel rooms is probably insulting as well. So there's a lot of work to do.
The ex-NBC anchor also made some interesting comparisons between quinoa and the Democratic Party. Let's listen.
It was when they handed out camo hats that said Harris Walls, and the Democrats they were kind of charmed by that. Their party has gone quinoa, and the rest of America's eating at Cracker Barrel. And so it was kind of an ironic use of something millions of Americans put on their heads to start their day every day.
I like quinoa just fine.
I knew you would find some way to take the contrarian view on all of this. So I like Brian Williams. I know we often criticize mainstream media figures on this show, and
he looked good.
He did look good, and I liked his pop collar jacket and all of that. But look, I liked him as an anchor. I know there was the now infamous controversy when he made false statements about a helicopter ride years and years ago. It was a big media scandal. I think he's a very good anchor. I, even as someone who likes him a lot, would not have anticipated that one of the, to my mind, best critiques of the Democratic Party in this election would come from Brian Williams. I agree with pretty much everything he said there. Yeah. I think that it was really, and it is really important, to emphasize the degree to which the Democratic Party seemed to lose touch with working class voters who had been the bedrock of the Democratic Party traditionally, and how it had sought to minimize issues that are really legitimately important to people. And he mentioned immigration, which I think among the sort of DNC type elite Democrats the assumption tends to be that anyone who's concerned about it is a nativist or a racist. Nativists and racists exist, but lots of people are concerned about those record numbers we saw late last year, the strain it places on infrastructure, all of that, and I think it's a legitimate point.
Yeah, public opinion is just so overwhelmingly, it's public opinion is to my right on this issue.
Right.
I'm the right of center host on this show.
Right.
It's there's a desire to do something about it, and in terms of the economy as well, and they never really. Well, okay, so a couple things. One thing. It is astonishing and quite an accomplishment that Trump has managed to make the Republican Party more better liked by working people, or at least Trump is liked by working people. There's some question if Trump were to,
Not be there.
disappear, vanish into thin air tomorrow,
Right.
whether the Republican Party would retain the loyalty of the working class. I could see arguments in both directions, mostly without wholly changing the political agenda of the Republican Party. I mean, we are right. We're going to see what kind of policies come forth because he has assembled a cabinet. We talked about that earlier in the show that has a range of kind of ideological views. I would say that they're more united. What is the common thread is that they are effective communicators for Trump on cable news and on social media, that they have entertainment and star power themselves. There's not necessarily ideological consistency or consistency in backgrounds at all. The backgrounds are all over the place.
Sure.
The through line is that they are effective communicators in the medium that Trump values, TV, social media, etc. But we have to still see what the policies are going to look like, and if they're going to address working class issues. That's clear. I think the working class, rightly or wrongly, thinks immigration is having a bad impact on their own economic reality in terms of competition for jobs and wages. There's that argument in addition to the crime and kind of social unrest. The immigration argument that most resonates with me, or that I think is probably most valid, is the swamping of social services in places where they've been forced to forced to congregate, and I see why that would irritate hardworking, tax-paying Americans. The economic impacts of immigration are debated by economists, and they'll point to generally good things resulting for the economy with the free flow of labor, just like the free flow of any other resource. But on the the lowest end, you do obviously have an impact on the competition for wages. Right. So that is an issue where I think Trump is actually wants to address a tangible concern of the voters, to the extent that they care, and I agree with Brian Williams that they do, about the high cost of goods and services. I think Dems could have hammered Trump on, aren't tariffs going to just result in all those things becoming more expensive? But they didn't really make that case because they themselves have tariffs and believe in tariffs to some degree.
Absolutely. And, I think there are massive question marks over whether Trump's policies will actually help the lot of working class Americans. But I do think it is really important, just to get back to William's point and to other people who make a similar point, there is this sense that the Democratic Party, in many of its policies and sensibilities, is now driven by very affluent, very highly educated people, to whom something like a rise in unauthorized immigration is not really that personally dangerous. In other words, someone who comes across the border undocumented from Guatemala is not generally going to be working, with all due respect to them, as a lawyer or a think tank person or a reporter or TV host for that matter. And so the pressure is greatest at the lowest end of the income scale. And just there's so much I could say about this, but just to raise one other point, because we were talking at another point in today's show about a debate between Bill Maher and Neil deGrasse Tyson that hit on the issue of trans rights and all of that. This concentration on what is sometimes called identity politics or social issues is something that I think the Democratic Party has to think very seriously about, because I am old enough to remember when the traditional left position was be wary of the sort of capitalist classes dividing and conquering by focusing on identity at the expense of economic interests. And the whole foundational idea of organized labor is we might have different skin color, we might be of different gender, we might go to different churches,
but we have common
interests. And that has been, I think, greatly diluted by such a concentration on social issues.
Just to briefly go back to the point you just made about the lower income workers. I mean, I do find this fascinating because it is going to be an intellectual debate at some point. I mean, because you can take that argument too far. Like we could, on the extreme end, we could ban computers, or we could create more jobs for typists again, right? There's creative destruction in the economic sector where jobs phase out because of technological innovation. And if we're if we're always at, if we're willing to pay any cost on the economy at large and society at large to protect and retain some of those jobs, you're going to end up doing things that are economically very nutty from the standpoint of the rest of the country, but might be in the narrow interests of that slice of the labor pool. And so I worry about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And you do have, things change. No, there is not going to be some resurgence of steel making in the United States at this point. It's just not going to happen.
It's not going to happen. All right, more Rising still to come. Stay tuned. We've got a lot more to talk about. We'll be back in just a minute. Many political prognosticators have written off Kamala Harris's future political chances or ambitions, but the vice president may not be going away anytime soon, according to a report from this morning.
That is right. Politico is reporting that Harris will stay in politics and perhaps make a run either for governor in California in 2026 or make another run for the White House in 2028. If she chose option B there, that would set up a race potentially with current California Governor Gavin Newsom, who is considered one of the many Democratic leading contenders for 2028.
So this is a little surprising to me that she, I guess keeping your options open is not the same thing as abjectly declaring you want to stay in the field of politics. She seems pretty checked out to me, and she lost, and I would guess that she doesn't have necessarily a bright political future ahead of her. She's already been the vice president. I kind of expect her to go like the speaking route or media route, or take a, Harvard Institute of Politics fellowship type thing, rather than actually, get down to work and try to run for office again. Mm-hmm. She's actually never had a tremendous amount of success. I mean, she was elected senator from California, so maybe she could get elected governor there. That doesn't seem totally outside the realm of possibility to me. It's a little bit of a step down from being vice president. It would be not totally historically unprecedented in all of American history. I think John Quincy Adams returned to the House of Representatives after being president, and President Taft became Supreme Court Justice and Chief Justice of the Supreme Court after serving as president. Perhaps there were vice presidents that served in different roles after leaving office, although none of them come to mind. But you do have to go back some ways to find someone who stayed in, or who took a kind of lesser or different position. Or she could run for president again. I don't know. I kind of think the Democratic Party is going to be looking elsewhere by then, or Democratic voters at least. Certainly if the elites conspire to just have her be the nominee as they did last time, anything is possible. But maybe she senses this is her moment given that there's going to be a power vacuum in the Democratic Party. If she really wants to, this is her time to become its intellectual figurehead or something. But I don't know. What do you think?
I mean, if I was a friend of Kamala Harris, which I should say I'm not, I would advise her to get out of politics. I think she would have a much brighter future on that speaking circuit, on that sort of world leader, opinion leader kind of, going, making big speeches, writing books about noble ideas, maybe having some media presence. I would pour the Chardonnay and kick back if I was her. I agree with you, absolutely. So the problem is that, what is the appetite for Kamala Harris really staying in frontline politics? She ran okay, I would say, neither terrible nor brilliantly. She lost in the end. American politics traditionally has been pretty harsh on losers, though of course Donald Trump came back from 2020 and Richard Nixon came back from 1960 and then won again back in 1968. But it is typically a difficult thing to do. And, I remember, for example, after John Kerry lost in 2004, that he had sort of kind of maybe suggested that he might go again. Nobody. There wasn't some like pro-John Kerry constituency. No. And I have never been persuaded that there's really a massive pro-Kamala Harris constituency. Now, this isn't just obviously to beat up on Democrats. I do think looking ahead to 2028, someone like Gretchen Whitmer, I think, could be potentially a very strong candidate for the Democrats. I wonder, will the experience of having two female nominees lose weigh against a figure like Whitmer? Newsom is someone I have been a little skeptical of as a national politician. I think he's good as the governor of California in communicating a liberal position and in using that platform to make liberal arguments. Would he get elected nationally? I'm more skeptical of that.
I don't know if the Democrats will make this mistake again. They certainly are capable of making it again, but if they really want to win, the reason Gretchen Whitmer and Josh Shapiro are going to be appealing figures is not just because they're somewhat successful governors, and I should say I don't care for Gretchen Whitmer at all as a former resident of the state of Michigan, but she is a national known person who is well liked by her own party certainly, and some other people as well. They are governors of the must-win pivotal swing states. Why would you get more California? California is going to the Dems by a smaller margin than it did previously, but it's not this kind of strategy. The way we're in now with these relatively extremely close elections hinging on the outcomes in 5 or 6 states and really just 3 states. The last 3 elections now have been decided. I mean, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada are also swing states, but they have been decided, each of the last 3, by Michigan and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. So the Dems, if they get serious about winning, are going to want political figures from those states,
well,
right?
also, I feel like I should preface this with the classic, a lot of my friends are Californians, but California has like a really quite bad political image problem in the sense of making that appeal to those heartland states. It is far too easy, I think, for the right to characterize California, fairly or unfairly, as this sort of liberal redoubt where it has all these cutting-edge progressive ideas that aren't in tune with the rest of the country. I'm not sure I agree with that, but it certainly works as an attack line.
I frankly think Newsom might be one of the few people I can propose who is a less appealing political figure than Kamala Harris. Newsom is, it seems to me, too moderate to make California liberals like him. In fact, a lot of them dislike him extremely because there's, I think, a insincerity or a fakeness to his progressive bona fides, that they're not real. You know, he's a affluent seeming person, a stylish man, you know, went to French Laundry during the lockdown, that kind of thing. But for his somewhat level of moderating has not seemed to win him any accolades or fans on the right. Like, he is still routinely positioned as a villain throughout conservative media. So it just seems to me he's landing in that middle zone where you've pleased absolutely no one. So I don't know whose idea it is that he should be the just because he has like nice hair or something. It seems like a very shallow analysis.
I feel slightly envious of his hair. Not enough envious of his political appeal. And maybe it'll be Big Gretch after all, Robbie. You could be a proud Michigander as she makes a rolling run to the presidency.
I would be deeply unhappy about that, but you know what? I would certainly enjoy talking about it and elaborating. I can picture many, many radars on all of my issues with Gretchen Whitmer. So
Democratic nominee.
You would have that to look forward to, Niall.
Delight, as always.
More Rising right after this. Stay tuned. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is under fire. Canadians are fuming after he attended a Taylor Swift concert as anti-Israel protests swept the streets of Montreal on Friday night. Rioters set cars on fire, caused property damage, burned a sculpture of Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu.
Police used tear gas to disperse the protesters and get the upper hand. Trudeau, meanwhile, was seen dancing to and enjoying the tunes of Taylor Swift's Shake It Off, Cruel Summer and more during the final leg of her Eras tour in Canada this weekend. Quebec Senator Leo Housakos voiced his concerns over social media, writing on X, "While Justin Trudeau is partying it up in Toronto, I was meeting with several members of the Jewish community of Montreal. Meanwhile, this is our hometown tonight," Housakos said, while posting videos of the riots. He went on that the pro-Hamas crowd, emboldened by Mr. Trudeau's pledge to arrest the Israeli PM, "Hope you had fun at the concert though, Justin."
Everyday Canadians also had harsh words for Trudeau. One wrote, "Trudeau is the one who needs to be arrested. Disgusting. We Canadians love to impeach him if possible. He's a spoiled brat." Not a word on the MSM. I hope he got a pretty friendship bracelet, referring to the bracelets that are often exchanged at Swift's concerts. I've never been to a Taylor Swift concert. So
sad, Robbie, sad. I have never been, but I'm a bigger Taylor Swift fan than you are.
Oh,
so I'm probably going to defend Mr. Trudeau.
Well, go forth then. He's entitled to a night off, although it's never a good look for a politician when the streets are on fire and you're fiddling or etc. Although. Well,
it is not a good look. The optics, as they say, are not great. And I don't want to minimize the violence or rioting that took place. But a persistent annoyance of mine in politics, regardless of the ideology of the politician that it is directed against, is a sort of concern with political theatre that has no real substantive effect. So Justin Trudeau was not in fact going to, ride to the barricades or man the water cannon or anything else during this trouble that broke out. The trouble that broke out, we should say, did result in 2 vehicles being set alight and 3 people being arrested. So violence is wrong. I also, this idea that Canada or Montreal was set aflame or falling apart, I'm somewhat skeptical of. In addition to that, I just think that people are allowed, even if they're politicians, to be human, to enjoy the arts and culture and music and Taylor Swift. And, the videos that I saw of him enjoying himself at the Taylor Swift concert were fine. And he was, exchanging his friendship bracelets and all the rest. And I think I have no particular problem with it.
It says, according to reporting from Fox News, so they were described as both pro-Palestinian and anti-NATO demonstrators.
Right, exactly.
Which is an interesting
combination.
Because in U.S. politics, it's the Democrats and liberals obviously extremely pro-NATO, and then I guess the left is left and right are converging on the idea that NATO expansion has been an important contributor to what's happened in Ukraine and Russia. The tying it to what this is Canada's vote to agree that the ICC should be able to arrest Netanyahu on the spot, which I have been critical of, even though I'm not a supporter of or defender of Netanyahu whatsoever. I think he should not be the leader of Israel anymore, frankly, although it's not my business, it's on Israel to decide that. I am more skeptical than you are of international world organizations or them being forces for good overall, or that we should be subjected to their whims. But people who are upset. People who are upset either way should have the right to protest. One of my criticisms of Justin Trudeau is that really my only substantive criticism of him, because I don't live in Canada and I don't pay all that much attention to Canadian politics, except when we take note of their DEI or wokeness extremism or something of that nature. But they did seem to take significant steps to discourage or even criminalize the kind of trucker protestings over the COVID vaccine mandates, over economic activity in favor of those protests. I believe they went after PayPal-type services to make it impossible to express your opinion on that subject. So I actually don't like the crackdown that has taken place there on what ought to be. They don't have the First Amendment, but what I think from a pro-liberal values perspective, you ought to allow protesting and free speech. You don't have to allow rioting, and in fact, rather than allowing it, the police should work to combat it with an appropriate response. There should not be property destruction or violence or that sort of thing, but you and I agree on that. So but sometimes politicians go too far and say that, it was rioting when it was just protected speech and people, deserve to protest.
Sure. And Trudeau, to be fair to him, did release a statement on social media. I believe the rioting was on the Friday and he released a statement on the Saturday morning condemning the protesting, condemning the rioting, I should say, and condemning the disorder and saying there was no place for that, as did various other people, including the mayor of Montreal. In relation to the International Criminal Court, I've been more internationalist in outlook than you generally, I think, Robbie. I think that Canada is in line with the international community in its stance on that. I have no problem with it at all. I think that the evidence that Benjamin Netanyahu committed war crimes is absolutely clear as day, but he would have the right if he chose to journey to The Hague to defend himself from that. I expect that he will not be making any voluntary trips to anywhere where he might get arrested anytime soon. And, you know, my heart isn't exactly bleeding for any curbing of his travel or vacation plans. But, you know, Trudeau, I think, has...
No international Taylor Swift concerts for him.
No, he will not be following the Eras tour around. You know, I also think Taylor Swift herself has become this weird sort of lightning rod, even while making only rather mild political statements.
She's really trying to stay out of it as much as possible.
And encouraging people to vote, which we all agree is a good idea. You know, we're all in common ground there. Her Eras tour will be drawing to a close very soon, Robbie. I'm sad about that. I didn't get to see her, but you don't seem so devastated.
No, I should say I do like her music fine. I just wouldn't. I don't go to a lot of concerts anyway. I liked Anti-Hero. Is that the name of the album?
Yeah, the song.
I like the song very much, and I don't change the radio when Taylor Swift comes on. I'm not a Swiftie, but she's a positive cultural force, and I do appreciate that she does try. She has generally liberal politics, I think, but she doesn't care that much. She doesn't purport to be some lecturing, hectoring expert on it, and mostly just tries to stay out of it, and that's fine.
I should say that on my relatively brief record in Rising, I have a history of controversial views on music, because I was on with our mutual friend Amber Duke one day and expressed my fondness for Bruce Springsteen, which sadly is not shared by Amber.
Oh, nor I.
So look, this is going to be from now on the pro-Springsteen, pro-Taylor Swift seat, and I shall defend that position, those positions.
Well, he is an American cultural icon, and you have the right to like him, even though I find his music very saccharine, I would say. That does it for us today on Rising. Thank you so much for tuning in. Please be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we're now available anywhere that you can find podcasts, and we will be having blah, blah, blah. What did I say? We'll be back here tomorrow, and we can't wait to see you then. Bye-bye.